Welcome to this episode of the Fourscore Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. My name is Roger Clark, your host. This is part 3 of our Governor Pete Wilson series, a wide-ranging and intimate conversation with the former California governor that explores a wide range of subjects and issues that are both topical and timely to California and the nation. Pete Wilson was the 36th governor of California from 1991 to 1999, a United States Senator from California from 1983 to 1991, and the 29th Mayor of San Diego from 1971 to 1983. He's a United States Marine, serving on active duty from 1955 to 1958, and a graduate of the UC Berkeley School of Law and Yale University. Governor Wilson, through his life and lifetime of public service, has given us a powerful example of what it means to be a leader for all the American people, a true American patriot, a man who can teach and instruct us today on the principles of statesmanship that all current political and business leaders should heed. In our third episode of the series, Governor Wilson discusses what, in his opinion, is ailing California, the trouble with a one-party state, the importance of education, public employee unions, taxes, and the importance of sound fiscal responsibility. California. I, for one, was surprised when the 2020 census came out because, like so many of us, California since 1850 has been a growth state. And then we found out 2010 from 2020, yes, California was growing in population, but it wasn't growing as fast as the rest of the country. And Florida and Texas were doubling, or more than doubling, California's growth rate.
At our expense.
At our expense. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article in The Economist magazine, which is out of London. It was talking about New York, Florida, Texas, and California, and had a nice chart about growth compared to population growth. And I was really shocked to see that since the 2020 census, California's gone into negative growth. It's losing 700,000 or 800,000 people a year, and so is New York. But yet, Texas and Florida are gaining somewhere between 700,000 or 800,000 a year. So their growth has accelerated and California's got negative growth. What can we do to reverse that trend?
When I came to office as governor, very shortly after I had won the election, I had to meet with my director of finance, whom I had appointed, to work out what the budget for the ensuing fiscal year would be. The budget that I inherited was from George Deukmejian, a friend of years and years, of decades, and a conservative. He was shocked when he learned, and I learned at the same time, about 2 weeks after the election, having lunch with him in his office, that the decline in revenue that they had begun to detect in the summer, this was November, he was waiting for the October revenue numbers. And sure as we were sitting there, in walked his director of finance, and he said, "Governor, I have the October revenue numbers. We're down 260 million. I said, "Now wait a minute." Again, that was October, or the 4 months, the quarter plus October. And he said, "Oh no, sir, that's just October. For the 4 months, we're down 400 million. And there was silence in the room. Duke was shocked, and with good reason. And it was because finally what had come late to California, it was an international recession that was deeper and stayed longer than in the rest of the country. It was also a time in which base closures were occurring. The second one hit California hard, the Navy in particular.
All the bases in the Bay Area, I think, were closed at that time.
All the big submarine base at Mare Island closed. The Army Supply Center in Oakland. Northern California really got hit. Actually, San Diego was lucky in that the consolidation that the Navy was required to make occurred, they thought, most naturally by having it occur in San Diego. So it was about one of the few places that came out well. But the homeowners in Los Angeles, half of them were upside down on their mortgages.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a tough time. And when I announced the budget that I was going to have for the next fiscal year, the Democrats in the legislature hooted and hollered and laughed and said, dead on arrival, because I said, we are going to have a budget that, unlike this one, meets the requirements of the state constitution, that spending shall not exceed revenues. Simple, clear statement.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't clear to the legislature. They thought, well, the hell with that idea. And that's unfortunate, because what was happening is something that was even more important than the weapons contracts. All the things that were happening were on top of the performance of, frankly, of the legislature. Duke restrained them as best he could, but they were bound and determined to spend. And they didn't spend as much as they'd like to, but they spent a hell of a lot more, and they were also testing me. And the Republicans were not very courageous, because one of the things that was making life difficult was that 2 years before the election, there had been a ballot measure in which the people had voted to provide funding for school districts based upon the revenue taken in by the state. And there were 3 levels that prescribed how much would go out, and go out almost automatically to the school districts. Well, there was one way as a safety valve to have, in effect, a referendum that would undo that requirement.
Right.
It had passed 2 years before, and so when we came up, Democrats in both houses, the Senate and the Assembly, they just ignored it. And then on the final night of the fiscal year, they passed it. They passed a bill in which I had prescribed cuts that were very deep in that current year. The next year would be much lesser. The Assembly didn't, and they kept us there and kept themselves there all summer long. And finally, it occurred to them that they were up for re-election. This was about Labor Day. The Speaker, Willie Brown, and the pro tem of the state Senate, David Raperti, came to me and they said, okay, we're here to be realistic. We're here to offer you the maximum that we can get for the Democratic Senate and the Democratic Assembly is to go along with half of what you are proposing in the way of cuts. And I remember Willie said, Governor, take your choice. Whatever tax increase is least obnoxious to you. I said, they're all obnoxious to me. And so anyway, I then had a meeting with the Republicans in the Assembly. And I told them this story. And the then Republican leader, nice guy, Ross Johnson, said, oh, Governor, he said, I do hope you're not going to ask us to vote for a motion to suspend Proposition 98, which was the 3-level requirement. That was what the overage was all about. It had to be on the least revenue. And they didn't like it. Anyway, I said, Ross, of course, that's what I am going to ask you to do, and I'm going to ask right now, because it's the only way that we can avoid killing tax increases or violating the Constitution. So, of course, that's what I'm going to ask you. I said, let me see right now, by a show of hands, how many of you born-again tax fighters are going to support that motion? They're in an assembly that consisted of about 33 of the 80 members. How many hands do you think went up?
2.
Pretty good. 1. And I confess I lost my temper. But in any case, we had 2-year increase of one tax and 3 years of another, and then they would automatically sunset and there could be no change. I said, we're going to comply with the Constitution. That's what happened. They then tried in the second year to do something similar. And I said, you weren't listening last year, forget it. Finally, in the third year, Willie came out of the coffee room behind the assembly chamber, and he walked up to his desk, which was in the rear left corner, right nearest to the coffee room. And he picked up his mic. The acting president said, "The speaker is recognized." And Willie said, "Some of you are wondering why I am carrying Pete Wilson's water." He said, "You may not like the man, but he's no fool. This is as good as it's going to get. Vote for it." And he pressed his button, and of these 80 lights, all dark, his lit up green, meaning an aye vote. And then all of the Democrats went up green. And then all of the Republicans went up green. So finally we had come to an understanding, a realization that we were not going to play games. We were going to have to live within our means. What happened was that there was, in addition to a number of changes, we raised money for purposes that made California more attractive. And the word went out, and the professionals who were in the business of locating or relocating manufacturers, distribution centers, what have you, said, okay, this seems to be a different place. Maybe we better give it a second look. And I then said, you know what? I think it's time we all went on a trip. We being the speaker, the president pro tem, the Republican leaders in both houses, and a couple of others. And we went on trips. First stop was Minneapolis, St. Paul. The next stop was Chicago. And the format was that I would open it up, welcome our guests. I'd make a little speech. Then I said, then Willie, I will recognize you. And then we'll go to Ken Maddie, the Republican leader in the Senate, and we'll have about 4 of us making speeches. Then we will open it to questions. The second question we got was from a man in Chicago. And he said, "Governor, gentlemen, thank you for your invitation. I appreciate that. You've asked us to respond, and you told us that we should come to California if we have market share that warrants a second distribution center or a second manufacturing center." He said, "I think I owe you some candor. I am here to tell you that it's the last damn place in the world I would ever bring a new plant."
Did he explain why?
Yeah. He said, everything is wrong with California. The taxes are too high, way too high, and even worse than that, the regulatory excess is a killer. Hell no, I'm not going to come to California. Well, we went to the airport for the next stop. The Democratic floor leader, who was a very nice guy, was in the car, the cab with me, and he said, after about 4 minutes of unaccustomed silence from him, he said, "Okay, Governor, okay, I heard what that guy said. You've made a convert." And I said, "Well, good, Tom, because I suspect he said exactly what you would have said in his shoes." And I said, "We have got to change the image of California to make us competitive for all of the jobs that we're now losing to Texas and to Arizona and to Florida." What happened was it all worked. And by the time I left office at the end of my second term, California had experienced a tremendous comeback. We had, in fact, achieved a place where we were at one point almost ahead, if not ahead of France as a competitive economy. We did do all kinds of things to welcome people who were coming, whom we could bring to come, all kinds of different people. We lost the aircraft industry. We lost a lot of the weapons producers, but we started getting them back. I left Gray Davis, my successor in office, a surplus that was of about the same size as the deficit that I had inherited from a good conservative, George Deukmejian. I mean, he was shocked. I was shocked. So then what happened after that is they reverted to type. That's a generalization, but it's also a long answer. But that's the answer. And we are not competitive these days.
You pinpointed something that I think is also, we haven't specifically addressed yet, but people, I think, have gotten used to calling California a one-party state now. Been quite a few years where we've had a statewide Republican in the governorship, lieutenant governorship, any of the statewide offices. And you describe the process right now where you're going to head because you had a Democratic controlled Assembly and State Senate.
Let me correct one thing. In my first re-election effort, I thought I had a pretty good ticket running with me, and I also thought we were in good shape. I knew we were in good shape. Things that we had done had changed the attitude. Lo and behold, we discovered that I had a one-vote majority in the Assembly. And the last person who had experienced that, the same thing, a one-vote majority in the Assembly, was Ronald Reagan, 25 years before.
Here we have discussions, as you very well explained, negotiations, and going back and forth between yourself and people who do not see eye to eye with you politically.
That's a fair statement.
But it was a process. We do not have that now. With the governorship and the State House and Senate and Assembly are all of the same party. Is that healthy?
No.
Talk about that a little bit.
No, and it's definitely not healthy if they've achieved super majorities that mean they can pass anything and that the ballot measure, if one is presented, to undo it.
Right.
Can't undo it.
So I think we have a very similar circumstance now, according to the recent reports. I think that there was a preliminary budget that came out. Here we are in May, and we're coming up in the June is the deadline. But we're getting reports that new information is being put on the current governor's desk that the revenues are much lower than anticipated even 30 days ago or 55 days ago. Talking about a huge shortfall between spending and revenue. It sounds like something very similar to what you encountered when you went into office.
Yes, it is. The difference is that Deukmejian was a conservative, and the public had voted for a ballot measure that compelled, this was Prop 98, that required the 3 levels of revenue. And what was sent out to the school districts depended on the level of revenue. Well, we didn't have the revenue, so we complied with the Constitution and with Proposition 98. When I ran for re-election, I won handsomely, by about 15 points, ahead of Kathleen Brown, Jerry's sister, who was at the time the incumbent treasurer, state treasurer. And she was a very good candidate, very attractive. She was articulate, she had a sense of humor. She had, I think, bad advice from her campaign manager. I couldn't quite figure it why it was they kept hitting me. She kept attacking me and my strength. I had 3 goals when I came to office and when I was seeking it. One of them was to right the economic ship and get us back on our feet. The second was to continue what Deukmejian had begun to make California a safe place for decent people to live in their homes, in their offices, in their public parks, because things had gotten pretty tough, and he did a very good job, but he didn't get it all. There was too much. That was my second point. And my third was reform the public school system of California. California at one time had the best public school system in the nation. And in fact, they endorsed me the first time I ran for office. When I tell people that, their jaws drop. Because what happened subsequently is that a New Yorker came into California, recruited about twice as many people to be teachers as were then in the California Teachers Association, changed all the rules. The only thing that he was smart enough to keep was the name of the organization, California Teachers Association, to which great goodwill on the part of parents attached. They were all for teachers. Well, me too, and also in terms of adequate compensation. However, what happened was that they completely changed the standing and the purpose and the practices of the new California Teachers Association. They didn't believe in merit pay. They believed instead in seniority. They didn't believe in the kinds of things that imposed strong academic requirements. To the contrary, they had a terrible, terrible idea of what the schools ought to be. And you've seen some reaction to it. When this DA, district attorney in San Francisco, was put out of office by a recall, so were 3 members of the school district in San Francisco.
I looked at one of your early state of the state address. I'm going to go back to that. And you said, quote, "Nothing we can do can have a more profound and lasting impact on California's competitiveness than the quality of our schools."
Yes. And I believe it.
Let's just focus not on the university systems, but on the secondary school and so forth. To put it in a summary, where have we gotten off track? We had such a good public education system. You've already addressed the fact that I sense where we're really talking about is that the focus became not on the students, but on things other than the students, if I was getting the gist of your comment.
Absolutely. Here's what happened. They doubled the number of people in the organization, and I think it now numbers something in excess of 300,000. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Also, Jerry Brown, in his, I think, second term as governor, passed a state version of what became a 40-year federal Supreme Court precedent. The Janus decision overturned that one finally, but what happened in the meantime is that a similar version came to California. Jerry sponsored it. It predictably had people in it who were not of the kind that had been in it before he changed it. It existed for the exclusive purpose of improving, enhancing the quality of classroom teaching. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I was interested in seeing to it that they were changing it in a way that would improve the ability of children to become proficient readers at the end of grade 3. That's what happened when we started getting new employers in California who had decided, well, it's a pretty good place to sell and it's a pretty good place to do business.
Right.
That was terrific. The one thing that they did find very unattractive were the public schools, and the people who were hurt the worst by this were the people who had no option, and the families that were living in areas where neighborhood schools were the only option they had, and the people who were teaching were the most junior and had the least political sway. The people who were poor living in those neighborhood districts, their kids were not getting a fair shake, and it showed. It showed terribly on their test scores. What we did when we had come back and were prospering, we said, okay, we are not going to let this continue. Instead, I did 2 things. I was the first governor in the country to sign a bill that authorized charter schools. The other thing that was even more important, because it took a long time to grow the number of authorized charter schools, but at the point where we were able to afford it, I said, you know what? We are not going to send the money out to the schools for this purpose just to put it on the table. Instead, what we're going to do is create not a mandate, but a state program in which public schools can have no more than 20 students kindergarten through third grade per class, one teacher, 20 students, so that the kids can get the individual attention necessary to assure that they do become proficient readers by the end of grade 3. Because if they don't, they're going to fall behind other schools, other places. And employers are going to look at that. And we will keep losing employers that we have in this state that has created so many jobs, created so many companies. General Dynamics, the first week I was there, they left, went across the line into another state. That was the third thing. And it still is, because we have seen nothing but growth in the number of teachers. But look at what happened during the COVID pandemic. A great number did not go to school to teach their students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They said, we are endangered. Not much, not at the age most of them are.
Right, right.
Even the most senior. What happened was that the kids missed 2-3 years of school. That's criminal. I mean, they can't get that back without a concerted effort, and even with that, they're going to be late. And don't think the employers didn't take note of it. They did.
Thank you for joining us for this fascinating and informative discussion with former Governor Pete Wilson. My name is Roger Clark, your host for this episode of the Fourscore and 7 Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. Please share and like us with your friends. And be sure to join us for the final episode of our conversation with Governor Wilson, where we will continue to explore Governor Wilson's observations on California education, public employee unions, public safety, drugs, gangs, and getting California on the right track.